and me, and we're negotiating with the Spanish Foreign Minister, Mr. Alvarez, and the Commission, Šefčovič. And Fabian Quadro and I are joined at the hip. We won't agree anything that we're not both comfortable with. As I say, the Gibraltar government's made the choice about wanting to have this frictionless border, which I respect their views. They are responsible for customs and immigration and also thinking about the future of their economy. And I actually think they're making the right choice. But as I understand, having read the committee, you could come to a different conclusion. You could say, no, Gibraltar should keep its pretty tough border with Spain, and it should just take on the chin the fact that it's going to get tougher now that they are out of the EU and Spain is a Schengen country. But their view, having thought about it deeply, is that the border problems they've had in the past will actually probably get worse in that circumstance, and that's why they've opted for this model. So I think that's why it's so important to understand what they're trying to achieve, and I'm trying to help them achieve that in this negotiation, but absolutely safeguarding the British government's red lines, which remain Gibraltar as a sovereign UK territory, the base as operating as it does now, vital for our defence, and a deal that the government of Gibraltar are 100% happy with.
Right, so basically, Foreign Secretary, you're trying, as it were, to move the goalposts, I would say, because
the badgers.
Well, you've done this before. Right? We have some record on this, and all I can say to you is that there is a suggestion that you could actually, through this treaty, be doing things which would amount to not subject to this inquiry that we've set up, be deliberately keeping us and the public somewhat in the dark.
No.
I mean, wait a minute. You've just said that there would be a termination clause in this treaty, for example. No doubt there are many other things. You have to appreciate that we have not seen this treaty, nor to my knowledge has anybody else.
And to be sorry, I ought to have said, to be clear, the treaty is not agreed. And, as you know, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. I maybe overstepped the mark by saying that. I was just trying to reassure the committee. I'm not trying to move the goalposts at all, right? The goalpost was set in New Year's Eve 2020, when the framework agreement was put in place between one of my predecessors, Dominic Raab, I think it was, and the Spanish and the Commission. And I'm trying to kick the ball through the goalposts successfully by achieving this deal. But let me say again, if we can't get the deal done in a way that safeguards the defence, safeguards our sovereignty, and a deal that the Gibraltar government are happy with, then we won't kick the ball.
We do need to move on, but you are, as it were, constantly interweaving questions which are, in many respects, contradictory in the context of sovereignty. We'll come on to this later.
I don't think they are.
But you will say that.
Yeah.
But that wouldn't.
I would
wouldn't surprise me if you did say it.
No, what I mean, no. I care as much about British sovereignty as anyone in this Parliament. I care deeply about it, and
I'm very glad to hear that.
But I don't look. I mean, on my way to this negotiation, I went to St Pancras and I passed through the juxtaposed border controls, and there was a French border police officer in a French uniform. I didn't suddenly feel that St Pancras wasn't British. We made a choice to do things. Yes, but I think that's why I don't think having that sort of arrangement in place, if it's to the benefit of your country, is a diminution of your sovereignty. But as I said, if members of the committee take the view, actually, our view is the border should be where it is now, I agree, with the border controls on the border. It's a perfectly legitimate case to make.
We also think it's possible that is something that could be achieved in a different context. But
I think that's a fun. But I think that's why I was so keen for Fabian to be here, because ultimately what I don't want to do, and I think what British governments have promised to do, is not negotiate over the head of the Gibraltarian people. I think it's very important.
But that is also, as it happens, one of the byproducts or one of the aspects of the fact that sovereignty means sovereignty, and I've already been into that, so we won't go into that again, but there are inherent difficulties in trying to match up two things which may prove to be mutually inconsistent. That's all I want to say.
Okay.
But I do want to move on, and I want to ask about the defence side of things, and I'm going to ask Richard Drax if he'd be kind enough to ask the next question on that.
Secretary, good afternoon. Forgive me if I go at about 4 because I have a Defence Committee visit to Brussels. It's not for any other reason. As we've said, and you know, the ROC is of great military importance. Its function as a forward operating base hosts nuclear submarines and Queen Elizabeth class carriers. What do the United States think of the prospect of their service personnel, potentially in national security focused roles, being subject to EU checks to enter British overseas territory?
I don't think that is. Look, they've got to be negotiated. But in my view, as I said, the base must operate in every regard as it does today.
As an RAF base?
As an RAF base. So that means people and equipment, including sometimes, nationals of other countries and all the rest of it, you need to have them in that base, out of that base, working in the base, contractors going to the base, operators going. That's absolutely essential. Because if it's an RAF and a naval base, it's an important asset and it's got to operate in the same way. And what you've just suggested is not how it operates now, and I don't think it should operate in that way in the future.
Right, so you can assure the committee it won't operate in that way in the future.
That is what we're trying to achieve.
I'm assuming, Foreign Secretary, you've spoken to the United States and our NATO allies. We know that Spain does not like NATO ships visiting. The Red Arrows were cancelled the other day. Spain does not like Great Britain in or on the ROC.
I'm fully aware of that.
I'm sure you're aware.
Yeah, so one of the aims of this, again, take a step back. Why are we all doing this? The Gibraltarians want their economy to be safeguarded. Britain wants this last piece of the jigsaw to be fixed because, of course, Spain insisted that Gibraltar was kept out of the Brexit negotiation. So we want to get that fixed. And I think there is an advantage if we can get an agreement, which also would include a defence and security aspect to it, that actually we could...
What aspect would that be so far as Spain is concerned?
Well, I think if we can get this agreed, the relationship between Spain and Britain over this issue might get a bit better, which wouldn't be a bad thing.
You said a defence aspect.
Yes, so...
What defence aspect are you negotiating with Spain?
That you'll have to ask the Secretary of State for Defence. But,
You don't know?
I do know, but I don't want to answer for another cabinet minister. But what I'm trying to say is that one of the advantages of a deal, as I said, if we can't get a deal, we won't have a deal. But one of the advantages of a deal would be that all of this would be on a more substantial platform. So you wouldn't get the difficulties and the games that sometimes can be played, which I don't want to refer to. I want to make the negotiation even harder. But that's the point.
Secretary, I hear you, but you are the Foreign Secretary. You can't just say the Defence Secretary is going to answer questions on such a crucial issue as an MOD base.
In terms of
basic.
Absolutely.
May I continue?
Yeah, sure.
There is a fear amongst some
Yeah.
that there's going to be some compromise. Others would call it a sellout. So far as the
Absolutely
MOD.
not. There's
So
absolutely
can
no
you-
question. As I've said,
Can
base must operate in every regard as it does today. That is absolutely essential. So you're not going to have, Spanish inspectors wandering around inspecting the base. Not, all the fears you read about. That is not on. If we can't, it is a sovereign British base, a vital defence
You
asset.
mentioned discussions going on about defence with the Spanish.
Yes, of course we talk to the
What
Spanish.
are those?
Well, there are discussions as two NATO partners about how we work together. But it's not going to be absolutely clear. That is separate from the operation of the base and the way the base works. But my point is that if we could settle this issue through a treaty, then the relations between Britain and Spain, I think, would actually move on to a better place. And some of the things that would be nice to have, like being able to have, RAF flights that could fly over mainland Spain and all the rest of it. It would be much easier. We're going to come on later to PESCO. There are so many things the Spanish, can sometimes...
Is that what they're saying to you? That if you do something, we might let you fly over?
They're not. So to be clear, they're not saying that. I'm trying to make a more general point, which is there are some the relationship. But that's not the reason for doing the deal. The reason for doing the deal is to safeguard Gibraltar in the post-Brexit universe and to have a deal that is good for the government and people of Gibraltar. That's what
United
it's about.
States, what's their view on this?
I haven't actually spoken to the United States about this issue. I pretty much know their view. Yes, I mean, I know their view because I've seen it in pieces of paper, but I talked about everything else, I'm sure. And I know what they'll say, which is, this is a vital asset, will you safeguard? And they go, yes, I will. That's the whole point of the negotiation.
They are affected, Foreign Secretary, are they not, by Spanish fishing vessels in relation to our nuclear submarines, and also as part of NATO. That's been a problem. And you've just referred to the question of airspace. I'm glad you raised that, because there is a major question here. Spain does not allow us to have access to their airspace for military reasons. They even stopped the Red Arrows the other day from going across. So what I'm saying is that these are serious questions, and there are really serious inconsistencies in your approach to this. Which
What's
is
the inconsistency? I don't understand.
Well, it's for me to ask the questions, but I'm going to answer your question as it happens in my own terms. That is, you are saying that you think that you can come to an accommodation over this. The problem is that when it's properly investigated, and we're doing part of that now for the first time, we are now actually faced with the fact that there are things like military airspace over Spain. There are things like RAF personnel who are being detained at borders and things like that. We are aware of things that have been going on, and these are serious matters, and they're current at the moment.
Yes.
If there is a way of solving it and benefiting people of Gibraltar at the same time, that is another way of putting it.
Yes.
But at this juncture, not only because we haven't seen the treaty, but for the reasons that Richard Drax has just raised, the reasons why we're raising issues relating to Schengen, and also the question of the status of the airport as under the control and management of the RAF, is that within this framework and this attempt to be, as you put it, fluid.
No, the only thing that's being fluid is the border. I'm not being fluid,
I'll
you'll be
finish my
accused me of...
question first. I just want to ask you the question.
Yeah.
Your quest after fluidity could result if you put too much emphasis on moving towards the aims of the EU, because this is not between Spain and Gibraltar just. It's also an EU question versus the UK. And the reason you're here is because we're looking at it through the prism of the EU-UK treaty.
Yes.
Now, have you got that point?
Yes, I have. I just want to say one thing. There's nothing fluid about me. I want to make that clear. And the only thing that we want that is fluid here is Gibraltar's wish to have a fluid border with Spain. There's nothing fluid about giving way or trading in or selling out or anything else. It's just not what this is about. And to be fair, the outline framework has been there since New Year's Eve 2020. So there's been plenty of time. Of course, we don't have a treaty. We're negotiating a treaty. We have to do that as treaties often are negotiated in some private space, because it's really hard work trying to get this stuff right. And I'm delighted to be here trying to answer questions about it. And I'll come back as often as you like to talk about it. But we're trying to negotiate the treaty, and then obviously if we have one, it'll be published and dealt with and constitutional reform and everything else. We're asking the right
questions. So, Richard, do you want to follow up on any of that?
No, I'm happy.
Well, in that case, I'm going to ask David Jones if he'd like to ask some questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, Foreign Secretary.
Hi, David.
It's very odd not to call you Prime Minister, but nevertheless.
Call each other David, an alternative.
Can we go back to this issue of fluidity?
Yeah.
You made it clear that, forgive me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, but you made it clear that the issue of fluidity is the prime consideration in these negotiations.
Of the Gibraltarian government.
I understand that.
That's that. And I wouldn't. I mean, if Fabian was here, he might put it differently. But the way I'm putting it like this is to try and explain, why are we having this discussion? Why do all these questions arise? It comes from that aspect, which is probably the most difficult to get right. But that's where a lot of the issues come from. Yeah?
Yes, the committee, as you probably know, has in fact visited Gibraltar. And the issue of a fluid border was made clear to us both by the Gibraltarian government and by ordinary Gibraltarians, the chief thing that they're concerned about, particularly business people. So we understand that. The fact is that at the moment the border is relatively fluid. Up to 15,000 people come across from Spain, as you said, every day to work. And frankly, the only times where There's a problem with fluidity is where the Spanish have been adopting obstructionist policies. And that does happen from time to time. In fact, the Chief Minister told us that on occasions the queues to go across the border have been over 6 hours.
Yeah.
So I think everyone understands this is a problem. But would you accept that it's largely been a problem of the Spaniards' making?
I'm obviously trying to negotiate with the Spaniards, so I want to be careful what I say.
You're also giving evidence to a select...
Look, no doubt about it, in the, 20-odd years when I've been dealing with these sorts of things, that has often been a problem. I think right now, to be fair, they haven't fully introduced the Schengen checks that you would have on a Schengen border with a non-EU country. So the difficulty is that if that were to happen, and it would happen, I suppose, in a non-deal scenario, you would have more questions and checks at the border, because you have to check on the 180-day, 90-day thing, you have to check on purpose of visit, you have to check on other Schengen-y things. And at that point, the situation could get worse, which is why the Gibraltarian government and people want to try and put this beyond doubt. So I think you have to bear that in mind. The status quo is not forever.
Yes, I think that's fair.
And the status quo, as you said, can be switched on and off to a certain degree, and that's frustrating. But I think the status quo would get worse in a full Schengen check scenario.
That's the reason you say that we need Schengen border control on British territory at the airport.
Well, that is, I didn't say it. Dominic Raab said it in the negotiations that completed in New Year's Eve 2020. The Gibraltarian government believe it very profoundly, and having come into this job and looked at this whole issue, I can understand why the Gibraltarian government have reached this opinion, and I'm trying to work with them through this negotiation to bring about what they want, while also bringing about the important outcomes that we want too. But I can totally see, if you were running an economy entirely services based, hardly any goods produced, extremely successful, very wealthy part of our of the continent, you would prioritise, I think, the people coming to work in your services economy, because it's vital for their economic future, which they've done extremely well to carve out.
You'll appreciate the committee's concern about foreign border guards being present.
Yes, I totally understand.
You mentioned St Pancras, but of course there is a difference between the state of affairs at St Pancras and what is proposed at Gibraltar, because, for example, a British citizen flying into Gibraltar Airport would be required to give his or her personal details to a foreign border guard. That is obviously a different state of affairs from where that citizen is going to a foreign country, which is the case when he or she goes to St Pancras.
I don't think it's that different. The point is that, I make the argument two ways. One is having a French border guard at St Pancras doesn't make St Pancras any less British, point one. Point two, it was done for good reason, because we wanted to try and make the border work better between between France and Britain. And thirdly, the point has been made, I think, at your last meeting, well, it's not totally symmetric because you don't have a Gibraltarian border guard in Spain checking in Spanish people as they come into Gibraltar. But the difference is you're going from Britain, a third country, into Gibraltar and then into all of Schengen, should you wish, whereas if you cross from Spain to Gibraltar, you're just in Gibraltar, you don't get to go to Britain.
If you don't particularly want to go into Schengen, you're nevertheless required to produce your
absolutely
passport.
bang on. I think that's the point. And this is one of the, we haven't, this negotiation isn't finished. There are all sorts of things to discuss. But, this is one of the questions we're going to have to answer. Because
that's still being negotiated.
Well, everything is being negotiated until...
So that aspect is not completed.
No, but I don't want to mislead in any way. The working assumption is that you arrive in Gibraltar, you go through Gibraltarian checks, you go through the Schengen checks, then you're in Gibraltar, and you can go to Spain without any further let or hindrance, should you choose. Now, that, I would argue, is definitely an advantage to the Gibraltarian people. No border, in and out of Spain as they like, 15,000 people crossing a day. I would also argue, there might be some people in Britain might think that was an advantage, because when I fly to Gibraltar, I have my checks done once, and having got into Gibraltar, I can go to Spain forward and back as often as I like. But you're absolutely right. If that were the case, a British citizen flying to Gibraltar who simply wanted to stay in Gibraltar would undergo a Schengen check without actually wanting to go to Schengen. So the question is, as I said, it's one of those things that flows from the overarching decision of the Gibraltarians to want to have the checks in the airport.
And that British citizen who is simply visiting Gibraltar would find that the length of his stay in Gibraltar counted towards the 90 days out of 180 that applies to visits to the Schengen area.
Well, again, nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. But and it's also true to say if you go to Gibraltar today, you are restricted to 90 days as a British citizen.
Yes, but that doesn't relate to
no. But your overriding point again is correct that if you put the Schengen checks in the airport, you check everyone through Gibraltar checks, Schengen checks as they come into the airport. That does have consequences for the ease of being able to go in and out of Spain, but it also has consequences for those people who don't want to go to Spain or who've spent time in other countries, if that's the way the negotiation goes. But fundamentally, the point, as I say, you've got this big picture approach by the government of Gibraltar. It has some consequences, and we have to all get comfortable with those, or not.
Would those Schengen officials be able to refuse access to Gibraltar effectively?
Again, everything to be negotiated, but fundamentally, at the moment, there's no right for anyone to visit Gibraltar unless they have the clearance of the Gibraltarian authorities, and in future there would be two sets of checks, one by Gibraltar, one by Schengen, and if there was a Schengen alert, yes, that could be the circumstance, if that is what is agreed.
So the effect of that is that a Gibraltarian border official would be able to permit a British citizen to enter Gibraltar, and then a few yards further along, a Schengen border official would be able to say to that British citizen, no, you can't come to Gibraltar.
That's not unlike what happens at St Pancras. And so you go through the British border, then you go through the French border guard, and if a Schengen alert pinged,
yes, but to remind
you would be stopped.
You're then visiting a foreign country and not British territory.
Yes, but it's the same concept that you are trying, in order to create a fluid border, you're having both checks at the same time.
I think we're back to your fluidity, if I may say so, Foreign Secretary.
No, I really object to that, actually, because I'm being incredibly strict about how we try and negotiate this deal. The only fluidity here is the border. I'm not changing anything else. That's the thing the Gibraltarians want.
Well, that's what you say.
Yes, could I continue, Chairman?
Yes.
Because
and by the way, they care as much about sovereignty, if not more, than we do. I mean, so don't, when you got Fabian Picardo in the room with me, I think it defines people in Gibraltar. They care so passionately about their British sovereignty. The idea that they're going to sign up to some sellout deal, I think, is not a very sensible contention.
under the terms that you're proposing in the negotiation, would the entirety of the Schengen Convention apply to Gibraltar?
I don't know the answer to that question because that is all still being negotiated. They're not. Well, let me try and answer it better. It's crucially important because they're not joining Schengen, right? They're basically trying to create a Schengen adjacent territory in order to have use the word again, fluid border, right? That's what they're trying to do. So that doesn't mean you have to do everything. Doesn't mean you have to do everything in exactly the same way as everybody else. But of course, that's part of the argument we're having in these discussions. It's quite important because they weren't in the single market. They weren't in the single market for services. They're not going to be in the single market for services. They're really just trying to achieve this border thing. So it's not, every situation in these complicated negotiations is different, but it's worth bearing that in mind.
This is extremely important because I think we do need to have a flavour of what is proposed in relation to the Schengen Convention. For example, would Article 40 of the Convention, which is the provision relating to surveillance supply, whereby Spanish police authorities would be able to cross the border to continue surveillance.
These are exactly the sort of things that we are discussing. As you can imagine, there's huge concern about getting this right, both from the Gibraltarian side and for our side. I can't give a sort of running commentary on where we are at the moment.
Can you go so far as to say that that is potentially the case?
We have to try and make, if this is going to work, we have to get agreement with the Spanish and crucially here with the EU about how the border would operate. And so this is very much part of the discussions.
With Article 41, which would give Spanish Guardia Civil officers the right to enter Gibraltar in hot pursuit, would that apply?
Again, I can't give a running commentary on where we are. There are all sorts of issues here about what Gibraltar and the United Kingdom would be prepared to sign up to. All sorts of questions about reciprocity.
Surely the United Kingdom couldn't agree to foreign police authorities coming in hot pursuit without consent.
Could the Spanish authorities agree to Gibraltarian authorities doing hot pursuit into Spain?
Well, that's not really the question. The question.
Well, that's the question I've got in my mind.
Well, that's not the question I've got. The question I've got is whether British sovereign territory is potentially to be infiltrated by Spanish police authorities who want to carry on surveillance or want to carry on hot pursuit on British territory.
Well, these are if you try to achieve a Schengen adjacent territory in your negotiations with the European Union, you're going to have to discuss all sorts of different issues, and we're discussing that. We have some things that we absolutely wouldn't say yes to, and some things that we are happy to discuss. And
so you're happy to discuss that?
Well, look, in a negotiation you have to discuss everything. Doesn't mean you're going to agree to it. And as I say, let's ask, put it around the other way. Are the Spanish happy for Gibraltarian police to do hot pursuit into Andalusia?
As I say, I'm really more concerned as to the impact on British territory. And the issue of ECJ jurisdiction, you said that there would be no direct ECJ jurisdiction, which tends to imply that indirectly there would be ECJ jurisdiction because domestic Gibraltar law would be altered to accommodate the jurisdiction of the European Court.
I might ask one of my experts to do this. My understanding is that this is not about, that they're not joining the EU, they're not putting the acquis into their law, they're not subjecting themselves to the ECJ. It's about writing some parts of the Schengen Agreement into Gibraltarian law, written in the Gibraltarian Parliament, judged by the Gibraltarian courts. As the courts do that, do they sometimes need to look across to decisions that have been made in the ECJ? Yes, they might want to do that, but that doesn't mean they have to align with it. It's a sovereign.
Those decisions wouldn't be binding upon.
No, not binding. Absolutely right.
Has the Chief Minister spoken to you about the Schengen Shack?
Yes.
The Schengen Shack doesn't...
He doesn't call it that.
But what he does actually.
Well, he called it... he did. Well, he said he called it a joint facility. But anyway, yeah.
He did the Schengen Shack when he came to this committee back in July. And he explained what the Schengen Shack was. He said it would be connected physically to the airport. The airport, of course, was quite deliberately built directly on the border. Yeah. So it's quite easy to construct a structure on the other side of the border.
Yes.
And in fact, it probably would be quite a good idea because there would be direct access to the airport from the Spanish side of the border, should everything else be agreed. And he told us that the Schengen Shack would be a common operating space between Gibraltar and Spanish police and immigration. It would be possible for the Schengen border control to be located inside the Schengen Shack on the Spanish side of the border. It wouldn't be necessary for it to be on British territory.
These are all of these, there are lots of options on this. The only thing that I think, if you're trying to be true to the New Year's Eve declaration of 2020 and trying to achieve the fluid border, you've got to do the checks when people arrive, rather than have border controls as people go in and go out. But as I've said a few times, and I'll say it again, because I think if we're going to have a difference between us, we've all got to be frank about it. If you want to have Schengen checks at the border, perfectly legitimate proposal, then you should get Fabian here and say, well, actually, we think that sovereignty will be diminished unless you have the checks at the border, and we want checks at the border. And then he can explain why he thinks Gibraltar wants a different answer, and we should respect their views and respect the choice they want to make as a country that's responsible for its own customs and immigration.
I mean, the attraction of what I've just proposed from a point of view of British sovereignty is that any British citizen wanting simply to visit Gibraltar would never have to pass through a Schengen border control.
The problem with that, I thought it was some genius thought. The problem with that, of course, if you take the border down, if you have a fluid border, a British person arriving in Gibraltar, going out of the airport and into Gibraltar, would be able to go into Spain as and when they wanted to, because there's no border check. So that's the problem with that idea.
But that is at the expense of compromising sovereignty, surely.
Well, the trouble is, if you had that arrangement, you wouldn't have done a Schengen check on it could be quite a large number of people who would go to Gibraltar, walk out of the airport, stay in Gibraltar, and then go to Spain. So you've got a problem.
Well, they could go through the Schengen shack. It would be.
Well, how would you know whether they? I mean, the trouble is you're then creating two groups of people, and how would you know whether the person crossing the border is the person who should be in the Schengen shack, rather than the person who's already done the check?
Well, forgive me. It seems fairly obvious. If you are flying to Gibraltar airport and you want to go into Schengen, you then go through the Schengen shack.
Yes.
If you simply want to stay in Gibraltar, you don't go through the Schengen shack.
Yes, but if you don't have border checks, how do you know?
But you do have border checks.
No, you don't. If you want to have border checks, it's a very different concept. But the concept the Gibraltarian government are most interested in is having people checked as they get off the plane or get off the boat. So once they're in Gibraltar, they can travel freely.
Yes,
You've got that. But if you don't do that, Robbie, come in if I'm being a doofus and getting this wrong. But the point is, if you say no, you can arrive in Gibraltar, go and stay at the hotel on the Rock, and then the next day walk into Spain. You're walking into Spain when there are no border controls.
Yes, I appreciate that.
Well, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? Because you're creating a big...
The point I'm making is it's not a huge problem at the moment because the border is fluid. It accommodates 15,000 people coming in every day from Spain to work in Gibraltar.
Under your idea, David, you would still have a border when people cross from Gibraltar to Spain? You'd have to, because otherwise people wouldn't know whether you went to the Schengen shack or didn't go to the Schengen shack.
Well, indeed. But the point is that you arrive at Gibraltar airport. If you want to stay in Gibraltar, you go through Gibraltarian passport control, or indeed, if you want to go to Schengen, you go through Gibraltarian passport control. If, however, you also want to go into Schengen, you turn right and go through the Schengen shack. And
but then what do you? Okay, that's fine. I get that. But what do you do with the person who goes through the Gibraltar check, goes to stay at the hotel, and then the next day wants to go to Spain?
You go through the current border controls.
But there aren't going to be border controls. It's a fluid border.
I appreciate that.
But that's my point. We come back to the same point.
Forgive me.
If you want to have...
There would be border controls. The point is...
Well, then you've got border controls.
That would be alleviated by the fact that you've got the Schengen shack and people arriving in aeroplanes.
Not really, because, of course, the major issue at the border is the 15,000 people coming in and out every day and the fact the checks are causing these 4-hour queues.
As I say, is only a problem when the Spanish cut up rough.
Well, no, but it is also a problem when the Schengen checks come in. Exactly. So I think you are, I think you are missing the point a bit, which is, as I say, it's perfectly fair to say to the Gibraltarians, no, you've got it wrong. Keep the border. Don't put the checks in the airport. Keep the border, and let's have a discussion with the Spanish about how we make the border work better. That is a perfectly legitimate approach. It's just not what the Gibraltar government wants.
Forgive me, Chairman. You appreciate that there is concern within Gibraltar about arrangements with Spain, given the history that they've experienced.
Yeah.
You appreciate that
yes,
they are very suspicious of the motives of the Spanish.
I mean, with good reason.
And in fact, only a few days ago, the Spanish foreign minister was saying quite loudly that agreement had been reached in the context of these negotiations for the joint management of the airport at Gibraltar. I mean, that frankly, if I were Gibraltarian, that would make me extremely uneasy. And frankly, again, as a British politician, it also makes me feel uneasy.
And he did say decided.
No, well, nothing has been agreed. Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed. Nothing has been finally agreed. Lots of ideas are going around in this negotiation. We're now, 4 years since the New Year's agreement. We're on what round are we in? 18. And, sometimes things go forward, sometimes things go backwards. Ultimately, airport is now in, or the air passenger terminal is now being looked at as part of the deal. If we can't get agreement about it, we'll have to take it out of the deal because it wasn't in the deal to start with. The point of having it in the deal is that we could make things better for Gibraltar. If it is part of the deal, you could have EU flights from other countries flying into Gibraltar Airport, which would enhance its status as a hub and enhance its status for services and everything else. But again, I say, if you can't get a deal with the things you need guaranteed, then we'll have to take the airport out and start again.
Well, he was saying quite clearly that that was an element that had been agreed. Are you telling the committee that that has not been agreed?
Nothing is agreed till everything is agreed.
So you take issue with Mr. Alvarez?
I'm trying not to take issue with Mr. Alvarez because I'm trying to negotiate with him, and I don't want to. I mean, I could give you a list of all the brilliant things I've agreed so far in this, but I don't want to do that because he might,
Your negotiation is essentially with the European Union.
It's both. It really is a four-cornered negotiation.
I appreciate that, but the treaty will be concluded with the European Union.
Yes.
And then, of course, we had the Greek commissioner the other day crowing that Gibraltar was Spanish. Does that make you uneasy?
If anyone ever says Gibraltar is Spanish, I get extremely uneasy. In fact, I'd say I get rather angry about it.
And you understand why Gibraltarians and, again, British politicians are concerned as to the EU's motives in these negotiations when you have a senior figure in the European Union saying that it's Spanish.
I'm always, you have to go into these negotiations with huge caution and care about everybody's motives. I just know what our motives are, which are, I think, absolutely the right ones. Secure the base, secure the sovereignty, do a deal that satisfies the government and people of Gibraltar. That's it. If we can't, no deal.
You don't feel you're negotiating with a crocodile?
I mean, Maros Sefcovic, I get on with him quite well. He seems a reasonable person who's trying to get to an agreement. He's trying to show flexibility because this is, if you think about it, something that's adjacent to Schengen but not in Schengen, requires flexibility on all sides. If you're going to try and get, as I say again, what the Gibraltar government says it wants, which is a fluid border with Spain.
Thank you.
It's all part, if I may, before I'd like to ask Paul Bristow to come in on this, but every time I hear you make these statements about flexibility and fluidity, it's not something which this committee finds terribly easy to understand for the very simple reason that sovereignty means sovereignty, territory means territory,
yes.
Borders mean borders, and they do matter.
Yes.
And therefore the sovereignty question which surrounds all these questions is vital because of our defence interests.
Yes.
Military airspace over Spain is not given to us by the Spanish. The Red Arrows were stopped the other day. It's an incident, it's a symbol. There are real questions which Mr. James has raised which are of incredible importance.
Unbelievably.
I hope you find that the starting of this operation, which was an urgent question, which I put up about 8 weeks ago, is helping.
It's really helping because it's helping me to focus. Obviously, you've asked. These are really important questions. It's incredibly difficult, and it's been really helpful. And your session with Minister Rutley was very helpful because, in this we've really got to understand what it is that's being proposed, what the consequences are. Is sovereignty safeguarded if we agree this? We've really got to understand that. So I think the committee's doing an excellent job at posing these questions. The only thing I want to make sure is that we understand why these questions are arising and what's the benefit the people of Gibraltar and the government of Gibraltar are trying to seek. Otherwise, it would be much easier if we just said, keep everything as it is, try to make the border operate a bit better. Very different deal.
May I ask Paul Bristow, please?
Thank you, Chair. And I'll try not to ask too many questions. But I was very intrigued, Foreign Secretary, where you referred to the situation with the French border control at St Pancras Station. I actually thought about this myself when I went to Lyon relatively recently. I guess an important difference, though, is that the French don't claim sovereignty over St Pancras Station, at least not yet. And so Spain do claim Gibraltar as Spanish territory. What weight has been given to that consideration?
It's a very good point. A lot of weight is given to it in that we should approach this negotiation with a high degree of scepticism, with very, hardened senses about not, agreeing to things that we would in any way regret. I would say, though, that one of the advantages, if we could get this treaty, even though it's a treaty, as I said, that would have provisions so that you could leave it if you wanted to, if we had the treaty, it would regularise and formalise the position in a very positive way, I think, for the UK.
I guess what the concern is this just salami slicing tactics?
No, because it really isn't, because it's not this deal, then another deal, then another deal. It's like, can we achieve this combination of things? Base, sovereignty, success for the government of Gibraltar. Then that's it.
How would you...
Because you see, they don't want to join the EU, they don't want to join the customs union, they don't want to join the single market. This is not like a kind of country that's sort of moving towards the EU in lots of ways. It wants this ability to have a border that's open because of its economic model.
Spain do want Gibraltar as Spanish
Of course,
territory.
and they're not going to get it.
And I just want to I certainly don't want you to upset the Spanish at this stage of the negotiations, but
Probably have already. But
how would you characterise the attitude of Spain during these negotiations, both in public and in private?
They say they want to achieve a deal because they'd like to, get this situation regularised and sorted. And don't underestimate the extent to which Gibraltar and the shared prosperity agenda between Gibraltar and southern Andalusia. Gibraltar gives work to 15,000 Spanish people, and well-paid work, highly paid work in attractive sectors. So, that's what they say. They would like to see a deal for those reasons.
A fluid border is in the interests of Spain as well as Gibraltar, right?
It is, but I think it's in both. It's the interests of both, but it's certainly the thing that Gibraltar wants that causes a lot of the questions we've been having to arise.
So if a fluid border is in the interest of both Spain, both the people of Gibraltar, and the status quo, and I hear you saying that the status quo, what did you say? The status quo is not forever. I heard you say that.
And that's the status quo about the operation of the border control.
As
that's
it is
just
right
simply
now.
what I know. But let me be clear, because I don't want to be misquoted. I'm not saying the status quo isn't forever in terms of Gibraltar. As far as I'm concerned, the status quo of Gibraltar as sovereign British territory is forever.
Oh, no, I understand that. And
I'm literally saying the status quo with the way the border controls are operating today, because they haven't introduced the Schengen controls yet. Full Schengen controls.
I appreciate that, and I certainly wasn't suggesting for 1 second you were saying the status quo around Gibraltar's place within, or as British territory, is the status quo. I understand that, but you said the status quo around the transitional border arrangements we have at the moment, if you like.
Yes.
That is not forever. But if that fluid border is in Spain's interests, it's in Gibraltar's interests, and it's working now. Why isn't it working now?
Because at the moment you still have times when the queues get quite long. And of course, the 15,000 people have to go through the borders every day. And also, there's, we think, been a bit of
It's only if Spain's attitude changes, right, and hardens.
Yes. So there's two answers to that question. One is the border's not operating brilliantly today, even though they haven't introduced full Schengen checks. Right. Also, it tends to be people who've got either temporary residence cards or British citizens who are having the worst experience at the border, frankly. So it's not working great at the moment. And if full Schengen checks were introduced, which is what Spain, it says it would have to do as a Schengen country next to a non-Schengen country, there's a good chance that the border situation could get worse. That's why I said the status quo isn't forever. We shouldn't think, we're not comparing the status quo as it is today on a good day with what happens when you're doing Gibraltar checks and Schengen checks inside the airport or wherever it's going to be. That's not comparing apples and apples. Do you get me?
Yeah. How would you approach it? How would you characterise the EU's approach and attitude towards these negotiations?
Oh, I think that part is sort of like, can we please? I mean, they're a bit exasperated. That's, I mean, to me, they're the 30,000 incredibly important people living in Gibraltar. But I think the EU is sort of, can we please try and make some progress and do a deal, because there are lots of other things we've got to focus on. I would say they've been constructive. I mean, they can, as you know, when it comes to doctrine in the EU about anything, they can be incredibly stubborn, and we've seen that over Northern Ireland and elsewhere. So there's a bit of that going on. But generally speaking, I would say that Šefčovič is, he would like to get an agreement and put this to bed.
And just finally, just going back to the issue of Spain and their attitude, are you confident that the views of the Spanish region bordering Gibraltar, Andalusia, some of the mayors and the administrations, have they been taken into account in the Spanish position, or is it all rhetoric?
I think they are in that, the Spanish government I think is quite cognizant of what the Andalusian border region would like. They refer to that. When I bring it up, they check it and agree with it. So yeah, I would say yes.
Okay, because their interests and Madrid's interests, especially when it comes up to European elections, if you like, are not always aligned.
Very good point. I think that's a very good point. And understanding each other's politics is very important, which is another reason why this committee meeting is very helpful.
Well, I'm very glad that we're being so helpful. Could I say, Greg Smith, would you ask the next question?
Thank you, Chairman. Foreign Secretary, after a big chunk of the meeting on Gibraltar, you may or may not be relieved to know we're moving on to the EU entry-exit system. The committee's done significant work on this. We know Go Live is meant to be in October, although there is still some fuzziness around that date. There are considerable concerns from the County of Kent, from the road haulage sector, from coach operators, from the general travelling public about the delays that may come about due to some of the requirements of the entry-exit system. So, for the committee's knowledge, can you tell us what UK-EU forums you've raised, concerns about EES in, and are we partially in the dark on some areas of its implementation? Because
I literally raise it everywhere I go, from President Macron to Foreign Minister Colonna, now her replacement, Stéphane Séjourné. I've raised it with Šefčovič, with anyone from the Commission I ever meet. I raise it everywhere because I think it is. I think we've made some progress since I think you heard from some of the relevant ministers. We're making some progress, but it's still worrying because we do have these quite sort of big choke points at Dover and St Pancras, and I'm really worried about there being long delays for people. And I think it's not clear to me that the technology still needs testing and improving and all the rest of it. And we've got to do everything we can domestically to get ready for it. There's a lot of work being done, and we have regular meetings of all the relevant ministers in a sort of sprint to look at where we are, what still needs to be done.
Has the technology been tested anyway?
Well, it's not obviously our technology. It is an EU scheme, and when it was first tested, I think it was found wanting, and that was one of the reasons for the original delay. So we are both getting ready in every way we can, but also talking to the Commission and others about how to make sure not only the technology works, but over time, it would be great if you had an app where you could do your entry away from the border. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on this.
I mean, on that point, on the technological point, I fully accept it's not our technology that we are questioning here, but we take the view that it's your job as Foreign Secretary and the wider FCDO's job to get the best deal for Britain from those abroad that we're dependent on. One of the big questions is the app that you just mentioned that allegedly has its, if I use the technological term wrong, I apologise, but its back end is apparently ready, but its front end isn't.
Right.
What negotiations is the FCDO doing with the French
I don't want
try and get that ready?
slide away from my responsibilities. I would just make the point. First of all, this is an EU scheme. They are putting it at their borders, but obviously because of the juxtaposed controls, there will be at Dover and at St Pancras. It is also a Home Office responsibility to oversee this, and of course it's the Department of Transport that have got a lot of work to do at Dover and at St Pancras, and they're doing it, I know, at speed to put those things in place. There are lots of difficult issues remain. Olaf, do you want to come in on this and say where you think we're getting to?
Just on your terminology is right for the different phases of the app. That means you've got the kind of the back end, which is being done by the EU by Frontex, and then each member state will add their layer onto the front of it. I don't think they have finished the back end yet, and then so our interest is both the timetable of that process, then the timetable for, in this case, mostly the French, but not only the French system that's being implemented, and the level of utility they bring to it. So we are absolutely raising that in every meeting and urging both greater flexibility and a faster timeline.
Well, given the timelines are unknown, would it not be sensible to try and negotiate a further delay in the entry-exit system being implemented?
I think that, trying to answer this question very diplomatically, I think the best thing we can do is to prepare as much as we possibly can to keep explaining to our friends in other European countries and to the Commission the technical and other problems, but do it on the basis that we're not the problem. We've built what we need at Dover, we've put in place the rooms for the terminals and everything else at St Pancras. Do everything we can, but keep having that conversation, because ultimately it's their technology, it's their system, and if it's not working properly, it would be a big hit to French tourism and everything else.
I certainly agree with that, but equally, if it's not working properly, it's going to be a big hit.
Yes.
On our side.
No,
I'm
this
to
absolutely.
the
Just
Kent
in my
and so
sort of
on.
talking points, whenever I go and see a European foreign minister, this is, after Ukraine, this will be point 2 or 3. It really does matter. We've got to get this right, and it's not entirely within our control because it's their system. But we're in a stronger position. What I'm trying to say, we'll be in a stronger position if we do everything we possibly can to say, look, we've put in place all the things we could do, but still, look at these projections.
So one of those things that this committee has heard evidence on that potentially would be something we could be in active negotiation on would be a derogation from the current setup of EES to be able for some of the biometrics to be taken away from port to close to shut down the length of time it takes an entire coach load of people to get off the coach and walk through a hut and put all their biometrics into a system. Are you asking for that derogation?
Well, as I say, this is where Home Office lead on how we manage this, but we're looking at all those sorts of options, including the different ways you might do buses, cars, so all of those issues being looked at. Can we do something specific with school trips? Yeah.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yes. Would you be good enough to tell us whether there is and has been a trial in Gibraltar on entry-exit?
On EES?
Yes.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
There was a rumour flying around that it had been. But
I haven't, Robbie?
We were aware that there were some iPads and some things about 6 to 9 months ago, but we haven't been shared any formal details.
Okay, thank you. Brendan Clark-Smith, please.
Thanks, Chair. Foreign Secretary, this leads on a little from what some of your answers earlier about whether EES would apply to British nationals who arrived at the Rock and then didn't actually leave the Rock to go into Spain under Schengen. See, some concerns have been raised about biometrics and fingerprints and whether this breaks the red lines or whether this is actually a reasonable trade-off or not. Have there also been any discussions with the Spanish authorities there or any reassurances about how they'd use this data as well?
Well, we're having discussions with them about how you would make this vision of checks in the airport rather than checks at the border, how you make that work. So that's what we talk about. And what I've tried to share with the committee is it's extremely difficult and complicated. And there are some, as you say, potential drawbacks, but there are also, for the people of Gibraltar and arguably for other people visiting, huge advantages. So we talk about all this stuff.
Okay, and in terms of entry-exit with the EU, how they would be able to monitor that at all?
Well, you've got this. It comes back sort of the same problem as having with David. If you, actually, it's an interesting question. If you just went full EES at the border, you really could have some long queues. Really. So that's why I think, I keep coming back to the same point, but that's the trouble. It's the EU system. They're putting it in place. We've got to cope with it because we're a third country, third Gibraltar. They've got to work out how to deal with it.
Thank you.
David Jones again, quickly.
Yes, just a very brief question. If chaos is caused at St Pancras and Dover, does the government keep open the option of removing juxtaposed controls altogether and reverting to what we had previously with controls on the other side?
I think that, I think the difficulty is that, juxtaposed controls have been, I would argue, an advantage to us. If we didn't have juxtaposed controls in Calais, never mind small boats, we'd have big boats. People coming off ferries, and they would be at Dover rather than at Calais. So I think the juxtaposed controls are good, and we've got to try and make them work in this new system.
I think that's the problem. I agree with you. I think that they're wonderful in St Pancras. You can get on the train in London and just walk off the train in Paris or wherever. Marvellous. But if in fact you're going to have to wait several hours and there's chaos in St Pancras or chaos in Dover, might not the only alternative be to say, well, they don't work anymore?
This is sort of slightly answer of despair, but if the system's bad and doesn't work, it'll be just as bad in Gare du Nord as it will be in St Pancras.
Well, it'll be half as bad because you'll have one more check as opposed to 2 checks, which you've got at the moment.
Total.
The issue would particularly be, the way the short straits work as a kind of as a system. If you end up with that queue in Calais, you still have the pushback of the queues into Dover, which is the situation, as you'll recall, we had before we had the juxtaposed controls. So you end up with the same problem.
So this could be really catastrophic, couldn't it?
Well, I don't want to. We are working as hard as we can to try and make sure that the introduction runs as smoothly as possible, but we are absolutely apprised of the risk.
Thank you.
Another question I'd like to put is, will the EES apply to British nationals arriving at the Rocks airport and not intending to leave the British overseas territory for the Schengen area?
I think we've dealt with this one, which is nothing is agreed, but the problem with the David Jones solution of saying if you don't want to go to Spain, you just do the Gibraltar Decks and stay in Gibraltar. If you have no border, then that person is obviously actually free to go to Spain. So you just create a system with a massive great hole in it.
So does that mean that Brits will have their biometrics taken and recorded by a foreign power to enter a British overseas territory that they do not intend to leave for the Schengen area?
I think we keep coming back to this thing. If you put the Schengen check in the airport, which is to have the open border, then that does have consequences because everyone will go through the Gibraltar check and the Schengen check and then stay in Gibraltar, go to Spain as they please. That's great for getting rid of the border fence, great for the 15,000 people going back and forward, great for anyone who's going to Gibraltar, wants to spend a day there and going to Spain, but I accept for someone who simply wants to go to Gibraltar and stay there and not go to Spain, if that was what ends up, that would be an additional burden. But I think when you look at you've got 10 million checks a year, under this system goes down to 250,000. And as I say, that's all part of the big picture of what the Gibraltar government wants to achieve.
And are you satisfied that these proposals, even with the fluidity that you introduce into them, does not break your red lines on sovereignty, jurisdiction and control?
I wouldn't sign anything that did, but in my view, you don't lose sovereignty simply because you have a Frontex border guard doing a check. It doesn't check. We're not less sovereign because we've got a French border guard at St Pancras.
Well, we've been through that one.
Well, yeah, we have been through it, but I'm not satisfied that I'm not right about it.
Yes, well, perhaps we're not either.
Right. Well, there we are. Good, but I didn't want to just leave you with the last word on that one.
Yeah, that's quite difficult to achieve.
I'm always up for it, Sir Bill.
Good. And the other thing I was going to ask is this. You see, we have heard that there are serious concerns with the direction of these negotiations, and we share them. We've already made that quite clear, as you know. And part of that is because you're approaching it very much from the point of view of a variety of different angles, from different territories, but of course this is ultimately, as we've said repeatedly, a UK-EU treaty. Put that in the box. The UK government, and only the UK government, will sign this deal with the EU, of course. That's the point. And it concerns our national security. We've already talked about airspace. We've talked about questions relating to people passing through borders who may be undesirable for a variety of different reasons. And one of our concerns is that it does affect our national security. And the reason it's our national security is because, in line with what the Constitution said, and as I mentioned at the beginning, questions of external affairs and defence are ring-fenced within the framework of our sovereignty.
Yeah.
One of the things we are concerned about, and I ask this question, do you not think that this arrangement that you're entering into could set a dangerous precedent for other overseas territories? And therefore, given what you said about the fact that, unlike what appeared to be the case a few weeks ago, and there was a bit of an appearance of a rush to get to the end of these negotiations and the opening of a tunnel, as they put it, I think, that what you're saying today is that you are pausing these negotiations for the time being to have a good look at all these questions, which we're putting to you, and we'd invite you to, in the light of this, to take stock and address these concerns before you go any further. I think it's implicit in what you've already said that you are doing that. Is that right?
What I said, just to be clear, I said, of course, after every round of negotiation, we have a good look. After every round of negotiations, we take stock. And as I've said very clearly, if we can't achieve a deal that we think safeguards all our red lines, we won't sign a deal. But we are committed to trying. We think we've made good progress. And obviously, every day that goes by is another day of uncertainty for the people of Gibraltar who would like some certainty in this regard. But just to be absolutely clear, we're not going to sign a deal that gives up British sovereignty. We're not going to sign a deal that in any way puts in danger the vital defence assets. Of course, with the responsibility I have for the other overseas territories, I look very closely at all of these things and think, does it have a read across or a disadvantage anywhere else? I feel passionately about these things. I'm the first Foreign Secretary to visit the Falkland Islands since about 1996. So I've proved with my own shoe leather that I care about this stuff. I really do. And I don't want to do anything that would anyway endanger other overseas territories that we have, vital as they are. I think the unique point about Gibraltar is that it has got this interest in having a more open border with Spain because of the nature of its economy. And I don't think that is mirrored in the same way in other overseas territories.
And there are also the questions I've mentioned regarding these, I say rumours perhaps, that RAF personnel were detained only quite recently. Do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that. I mean, I wonder whether it was when they were trying to cross the border because there are border checks rather than going to the base. The point about the base is it must be able to move people and material must be able to be moved into the base without let or hindrance. That is absolutely key.
And one last question. I take it from what you said that if we wanted to take this matter further with you or with anybody else, and of course we're anxious to see Mr. Picardo, as we're hoping to do fairly soon, but also, of course, the Defence Secretary, because he may have views on this subject, which he may or may not have communicated to you already. I
had a meeting with the Defence Secretary this morning. We discussed Gibraltar, among many other things. I think it's very good. I think you should have further meetings. As I said, I wanted to bring Fabian here today because I think trying to understand the connection between what the Gibraltarian government wants and our red lines on sovereignty and defence is very important. So I know he would be delighted to come again. And I think summoning the Defence Secretary would be a very good idea, and he can talk to you about the wider defence and security picture.
So if I could just ask any members of my... Is there any further question anybody would like to put?
Just one point of clarification arising out of one of these last questions. Is it the case that British military personnel would be required to give their passports to foreign border guards entering Gibraltar?
The aim is to carry on having the base work in every regard in the way that it does now.
So the aim is to avoid that?
The aim is in every way.
Yes. And just lastly, because we're just coming up to your 4:30 deadline, I'd simply say do look after the blue card holders.
Yes. Well, they are the ones at the moment, I think, are having quite a tough time, actually. That's part of the issue at the border. But my parting plea would just be, we should remember the double lock, which is that, Britain should never discuss, I'm going to read it to you, so we all do remember it. The UK government will never enter into arrangements under which the people of Gibraltar would pass their sovereignty of another state against their freely and democratically expressed wishes. Second, we will never enter into a process of sovereignty negotiations with which Gibraltar is not content. I mean, it's very important to remember that, we must be in lockstep with the people of Gibraltar and the government of Gibraltar, and that's exactly what I intend to do. And I just want to be clear that, Fabian, of course, he wants to get this deal. He wants to have this border arrangement to safeguard the future of his economy, but he's an incredibly tough negotiator. He is not going to give up 1 inch of sovereignty of the Rock of Gibraltar and Gibraltar itself, and neither am I. And you can absolutely be assured that we negotiate toughly, but more importantly, jointly. We agree everything.
And you can also take it that we as a committee have a similar approach in our questioning, as you probably noticed. One last point, and that is
thoroughly enjoyed it.
What you've just mentioned comes straight from the Constitution of Gibraltar, which I'm not sure you necessarily knew. But
it's the double. Well, I think it was it was a minister who originally
agreed after in 2000.
Can I just add one last point, and that is this: that Her Majesty's government, Gibraltar is part of Her Majesty's dominions, and Her Majesty's government have given assurances to the people of Gibraltar that Gibraltar will remain part of Her Majesty's dominions, amongst other things, unless and until an Act of Parliament otherwise provides. Yeah. So there are very, very clear lines.
Just to be clear, there's no question. Under this deal, there's no question of Gibraltar being anything other than one of His Majesty's dominions. Absolutely no question about that in any regard. It's all about, can we actually safeguard that and write that into a new treaty to give Gibraltar a new chance of success and thriving in this decade and beyond. And crucially, can we do something that gives Gibraltar's economy the certainty of continued prosperity and success. Now, that is something that's worth spending some time over, and that's why I'm delighted to be taking part in it.
And I must say, as the clock strikes, I would simply say I'm very glad to be able to have you here, but also to evaluate in the course of time whether what you've said to us today meets the challenges that we've tried to present to you.
And I will do the same with your questions and check that they are also ones that we've given the best answers to. Thank you.
We shall see.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Reading has ended.